This is data collection problems in scientific investigations. The main takeaways from this thing that I want you to be able to get is that there's, for just about any type of data, there's going to be multiple ways of collecting it. And some of those ways are going to cause problems. Some of the ways will work really well for what you might want to be doing. There's good points and bad points about just about everything you want to do. These investigations are required to collect enough accurate data to capture the effect of whatever variable you're trying to look at. If you can't capture the effect, you can't measure the effect, and then you don't know whether or not you're accomplishing anything. Whatever you do, don't try to get by with too little data. You'll be much less likely to find a real effect. Don't try using just 3 or 4. It's not going to do it. You're trying to simulate testing the entire sample population. If you're trying to figure out whether or not COVID-19 vaccine is going to be safe, ideally you'd want to test everybody. Obviously you can't do that, but you don't want to test a couple thousand just because there's that many. There's a huge number of variations in individuals, and the farther you go, the more likely you are to capture most of these. So that if there's problems when you're trying to administer the vaccine, if there's side effects that you don't want to deal with, you stand a much better chance of finding them. So you're trying to simulate testing the entire sample population. You don't, obviously, unless the sample population is fairly small, you're not going to be able to do it. So you do a subsample, but real small samples like 3 or 4, and some people have done that in the past, isn't adequate unless you're that happens to be the entire population. If you're doing gene studies or something like that, where you have very few test animals or whatever, that might be the case, but it's generally not. So, okay, data collection is done by measuring or counting. That's pretty much it. Either way, you need to use a method that's both accurate and precise as your experiment requires. Accurate means the values are close to the actual value, and precise means the methods can be repeated or produce results that are close to each other. And both of those are important. To collect your data, you can either count it or measure it depending on what it is. Both can be done directly, counting or measuring the data itself, or indirectly by counting or measuring something in place of the actual data that changes in a direct measure to whatever the data itself is doing. Both can be done by manual methods or by automated methods. And you may want to use either one depending on how many things you want to count. Counting things directly is pretty easy if there's not very many of them. If you have 10 or 15 marbles, for example, it's pretty easy if you can see them and touch them. If you can't count 10 or 15 marbles, you probably should be doing something else for a living. But counting very small things, say red blood cells, or very large things like cars or buildings or planets or moons or stars can get a great deal harder. There's a lot more things that you have to think about when you're trying to come up with a method to do that. One of the issues with measuring things is that all measurement methods have errors, every last one of them. You want to keep the errors, pick a method where the errors are small enough that they don't significantly affect your results. Very simple example is shown next. This is just 2 rulers. One of them is marked in inches, the other's marked in inches and 1/8 of an inch. The smaller 1/8 markings make it a lot easier to estimate the fractions. So if you're trying to measure down there, it's going to work a lot better. Here's the 2 rulers. There's 2 places on each linear measurement like this where you can make mistakes. The first one, you have alignment problems at the very beginning, wherever you set the base of the ruler. If you don't set it in the right place, you're not going to get good measurement. And then the other estimation is at the end of it, end of whatever item it is you're trying to measure. If in this particular case, if you're trying to measure something that's between 6 and 7 inches long, obviously you can get more accurate using the top one, because you can look up there and say, well, that looks like 6 and 3/8 or 6 and 6.5, somewhere in there. And the bottom one, you end up having to guess. Now that's the same kind of thing if you blow it up even farther than having small measurements between 6 and 7 and between the 8s going to 16ths or 30 seconds. It's going to do exactly the same thing. So that's one of the things you need to think of too. However small the measurement increments are, there's always pretty much something smaller, and that's where you can run into estimation problems. There's multiple ways to count or measure pretty much everything. If you have different sizes of marbles, for example, since I like marbles here, and you need to know both their total and average volumes, To measure them directly, you can measure each of the marbles, break out a caliper and measure each one of them, write it down, do the math to determine the volume of each one, and then add up all the volumes to get the total. Divide by the number of marbles and you get the average. That gives you what you want. That, if you have 10 or 15 marbles, is pretty easy. If you have more, it can be problematic. The other thing you can do, one of the other things you can do, there's lots of different ways to do this. You can measure it indirectly, put all the marbles you've got into a large enough beaker that already has some water in it, or you can pour a known amount of water on top of it that will cover them up. Look, after the marbles are in there, then you measure the total volume in the beaker, and including the marbles and the water. And the increase in the water volume is equal to the total volume of all the marbles. If you got a lot of them, that's going to be faster. And you can divide the total volume by the number of marbles in there to get the average volume of each marble. Now, you're not going to be able to get the distribution or anything else like you could if you were actually counting them. So the math starts to run into problems. Here's where it's going to make a difference depending on what you're trying to do with the results when you get them. The point is, if you have very few of anything, it's faster and more accurate to measure them and do the math. If you have a lot of them, it's probably faster and easier to do a different kind of method. In this case, the water displacement method that I was just talking about. Okay, let's say you want to do a traffic survey on a local street. You can sit by the side of the road, count cars, get a little counter out, or write hash marks down your notebook and count the cars as they go by. Great fun, sit on the sun, get a tan. But it gets kind of hard if you want to sit there and figure out how many cars are going to go by in 6 hours or all day or all night or something like that. Or if there's it's a multi-lane street, anything that confounds your counting is going to be problematic. Or you might be hungry and trying to eat and trying to look at your hamburger and count the cars at the same time doesn't work very well. There's this other thing that's real common. It's called a pneumatic tube traffic counter. Everybody's seen them, whether you recognize them or not. They look like a black hose stretched across the roadway. If you look over on the right side, there's always a little box, usually chained to a sign, so nobody swipes it. And there's a little pneumatic counter in there. So every time you drive over this hose, you get a count added to the counter in there. That way you can tell how many times it gets rolled over by a tire. If they're trying to do speed, sometimes they've got 2 or 3 of those out there, so they can get the differentials when the things are going by. You can't tell what kind of car or truck it was, but you can tell how many, and if you do it right, you can tell the speed. You can also use video cameras. Video cameras are used for a lot of this kind of stuff nowadays. You can use computer software or visually count the vehicles and the types of vehicles in the videos that they go by. You can fast forward them, whatever you need to do to get it done. You can use them to monitor and record traffic flow. As a matter of fact, if you look out on the freeways, there's lots and lots of video cameras, a lot of which you can actually access from the internet if you wanted to count something that way. And you can look at traffic flow and watch how many you're going by at various periods of the day, various times of day. So that you can analyze traffic bottlenecks, see accidents, whatever's going on. Another thing that very few people know about that's a use for video cameras, this is kind of a surprise to a lot of people. Many police departments, actually it's probably most police departments now, including Riverside City, San Bernardino, Redlands I know does it, use video technology to record the license plate of every vehicle that passes by their portable readers. They'll set them up on the trunk of the car and just park on a corner and record everybody's license plate that goes by. Good guys, bad guys, they just record them all. That way they can go back, and if they have a problem, they can place various vehicles there at that time of day. So just something to be aware of. Now, I spent most of my career in a hospital lab, in a clinical laboratory. All of the testing we do was on patients to try to identify disease and help physicians identify and cure what the problem was. They do a tremendous amount of testing. I used to work at Arrowhead Regional Medical Center in Colton, and they're now doing several million individual tests a year. That's a lot of testing. We've got a lot of automated equipment. We're still doing a lot of manual stuff. Wide array of these test methods. There's more test methods being used than you can actually imagine. Most of them are automated because it's much, much faster, and it ends up being much, much cheaper. Some of them still are manual. Methods have changed a lot over time as the instruments and computers get better, faster, and we come up with new ways to make things to to identify and test them. And we find new things to test as well. A couple of years ago, we didn't know about testing for coronavirus. Now there's hundreds of coronavirus tests being done every day. So lots of things there. One of the tests, this is just kind of a explanation of how we've done things over the years and the kind of changes. When I first started doing this a long time ago, we had a heart drug, still do, called digoxin. Dig assays were done using radioimmunoassay. To do that, radioimmunoassay uses a radioactive iodine, in this case, attached to the various methods to the drug itself, and then you count the amount of radioactivity. To do that in here, you make antibodies to the drug, another antibody to that antibody, you attach radioactive iodine 125 to that, so that the second antibody will bind to the first one. We mix some of the first antibody with a patient's serum, and any digoxin or any other drug we might be working on with the same method will bind to the first antibody. After you do that, wash everything, get the excess off, add the second antibody and radioactive iodine complex. The antibodies bind together, so the dig now has radioactive iodine attached to it. All the excess radioactive iodine is washed away, and put them in a gamma counter and count the radioactivity coming off of it. That's why it's indirect. You're actually counting radioactivity instead of the digoxin. Next, you plot the radiation levels versus the amount of dig in the specimen, and you can determine then how much you actually have. Now, aside from the fact that you're using radioactive material, the problem is that iodine 125 has a half-life of 60 days. So as you can imagine, the amount of available radiation is always decreasing. That can make things problematic. Since it's not very stable, every time you ran a test, you needed to set up a calibration curve with 5 to 7 calibrators and run 3 controls with the patient to make sure it was all linear and everything was working the way it was supposed to. And because it wasn't very stable, you had to do everything in duplicate. So it's a delicate and exacting process that could actually take a couple hours to run. And if when you got it finished, the curve didn't work right, one of the calibrators didn't work, the patient controls didn't work properly, you had to turn right around and repeat everything. And it's totally manual. So it was a very long and difficult process. Now, running digs, we replaced the radioactive iodine with fluorescent dyes that are stable and really easy to read. Tests are fully automated, much more accurate, and you put it on the analyzer, and in 15 minutes, the results pop up. So it's a great deal cheaper to run, and we're not using any kind of dangerous radioactivity. This ends up actually being more accurate than the first method. Another thing we do lots of is a red blood cell count. Each patient will get at least one done during every visit, and usually during most ER visits. For automation, we take a very small amount of blood, dilute it with a kind of salt water to mimic plasma so that the red cells didn't blow up or shrink up or anything else, and then count the red blood cells using a microscope and a special slide. After that, you go back and do the math to bring it back to the original concentration. It wasn't very accurate, but since you've got about 5 million red blood cells per microliter, counting was the nearest to the nearest 10,000 or so was enough. Problem was, it was really slow to do. To start to finish, to do one was probably going to take about a half an hour. This is what the special slide looked like. And what you ended up doing under the microscope, you count the number of red blood cells in each one of those light blue squares there. So you got 5 of them, and then do the math. And it's a lot of fun. It's kind of boring sitting there doing that, though. Now there's automated methods. This is actually one of the first automated methods they come up with. That little diagram right there, a company called Coulter came up with this. That little diagram right there shows you what is a saltwater bath that is isotonic. It's the same got the same amount of salt in it that plasma does, so the red cells don't change in size. There's an electrical current that is passed between the tube on the inside and the bath on the outside, and there's a little hole in there that the electric current goes through. When we put a vacuum on the center one, suck the red blood cells through there. And each time one goes through, it affects the current. It drops the current a little bit because the red cell's in the way. And we count the number of spikes that come through there for the current, and that's converted then to a red blood cell count. You can get multiple red blood cells going through there at the same time. So if you have too many, you end up with some calculations to correct the results for coincidence, is what they call it when you've got multiple ones at the same time. We can actually count measure the size of the red blood cells at the same time by looking at the average size of the peaks. going through there. So and now we use lasers and radio frequency and all kinds of things to count these things, the red blood cells and white blood cells, and identify them. Much more accurate than it used to be, much faster. What used to take us a half an hour and only get us a red blood cell count, now it takes about 45 seconds and gets you probably 25 different parameters, and it's much more accurate, much cheaper as well. Right now, Redlands Airport, actually where I happen to be sitting, is trying to determine how many airplanes land and take off every day. We're trying to figure out how some noise issues are going. If you're trying to count the airplanes, because this is what your job is today, is count these things. If you stand by the runway and count them manually, it's going to cost way too much money. It's way time consuming. And you're going to have to stand out there 24 hours a day for a couple of weeks, probably get a reasonable average. If you use a video camera, you can do that. It produces huge data files. I don't know if anybody's ever worked with data files off video or not, but they're giant, particularly if they're fairly high resolution. If it's at night, then you've got problems with being able to see the airplanes at night too. So you'll have to come up with some method of being able to identify each one of these things. If you use a microphone and a sound activated recorder, however, stick it out at the end of the runway and walk away, then every time somebody flies by, they're going to make a noise spike. Sound files are really small, so at the end of the day, you can either bring the files in the computer, you either count manually as you play the recording at high speed. Since they don't land very often, you can condense it way down and still count it, or you can import it into a computer, display the waveform, and count the noise peaks. Either one of those accomplish exactly the same thing. You can use sound too to count anything else that makes more noise than the background. You can do it exactly the same way. The point of all this is that there's a wide range of methods, both direct and indirect, that you can use to collect your data. And it doesn't matter what kind of data it is. Your data needs are what should drive your measurement needs. Make sure that your measurement methods or the accounting methods are adequate for whatever kind of data that you need to collect. You need to use a method that's simple enough to be practical, and it's accurate and precise enough to be useful, but you don't need to make it more accurate than necessary. I mean, it looks good, but you don't need to measure the length of a football field in millimeters. Let's see what else we got here. There's a couple of real world examples here that are kind of nice. It's a real world demonstration of the effect of accurate and precise data versus noisier, less precise or contaminated data. What we've got here is graphs, light curves from a couple asteroid occultations. Now, I don't expect most of you to know what an asteroid occultation is. What it is, it's the same thing as an eclipse. You have a star. In this case, it's BN Orionis, and you have an asteroid. In this case, it's 57 Mnemosyne, that passes in front of the light, just like the moon passes in front of the sun. When the moon passes in front of the sun with a total eclipse, then most of the light goes out. Well, the point here is that the same thing happens. The star is so far away; it's essentially a point source. So you can get timing of when the asteroid moves in front of the star very, very accurately. The whole passage usually takes 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, so it has to be pretty accurate. So you're measuring things down in the milliseconds. If you look at these next two graphs, the top one is from clear skies. And the data is really nice. The bottom one, there was thin, high clouds. They were even hard to see at night. It was pretty obvious from the data graph what was going on, but you couldn't really see them. They were so thin. They were taken from different view sites at almost exactly the same time. The idea here, they were trying to determine the shape of 57 Mnemosyne. Orionis is a well-known and fairly well-studied variable star, so the light goes up and down over a period of time. It's not a short period of time. It's day. I can't remember with this one. I think it's weeks. But anyway, the idea here is since you got a point source of light, you can be very accurate and precise in the timing data. Now, let me go to the graph here. The top one is the clean data. If you look at the data here, I don't know if you can see, hopefully you can see my mouse pointer here. On the left side and on the right side, there's a nice little cloud of data that pretty much goes along a line here at about 300. Actually, that's just kind of a featureless number there, but this bouncing around is caused by atmospheric turbulence. That's actually what makes stars twinkle, to be honest. But this is the light curve with without the asteroid being in front of it right along here. Now, here's the light curve from the one with high thin clouds. You see how nice and straight and flat this one is. You see how curvy this one is down here. Most of the variation here from the atmospheric turbulence is about the same, but the clouds, as they move in and out of the path of the light, cause the light to brighten and to dim. So this data is a lot messier here. Now, the interesting thing, looking at this one, this is when the asteroid passes in front of it. You get an immediate rapid drop down to almost zero. This isn't quite zero because of background light, starlight that's diffuse because of the atmosphere. It drops almost down to zero. And then you can see, just looking at the bottom curve here, you couldn't really tell much about it other than here it is, drops down and comes back up here. So this is the length of time that the asteroid is in fact in front of the star. And then we're going to use that to help calculate the size of the asteroid. Now, this is dirty data. Here's the clean data up here. As it drops down, it stops part of the way down. And then it drops the rest of the way down to almost zero. And if it comes up, as it comes back up over here, you can see it actually starts to come up a little bit slowly and then back up to where it was. So there's actually a double step in this light curve. You can see the second step here in the bottom one, but with all this dirty data, with all this noisy stuff, you never would have noticed it. You never would have been able to realize that there was something going on. What this actually shows is that instead of this being a variable star, this is in fact a double star. This is when the first star was eclipsed by the second, or the asteroid eclipsed the first star, and the second one is still showing here. So that's what clean data, good data, can do for you. And you can see here down at the bottom, you wouldn't have been able to find that at all because there's just no step here. And these actually, these were amateur astronomers using small telescopes. One of them was 8 inches, one of them was 10 inches, I believe. One of them was at the Salton Sea, and the other one was at Anza Borrego State Park. There were 10 guys working on this across the country. Only that one observation showed the star to be a double. So that's new astronomical data that one amateur really was able to pick up. So good data, regardless of what you're doing, matters. You might find something that nobody's ever seen before. In these cases, they're using video cameras hooked up to the telescopes, and they stick GPS time directly into the video files with a little electronic device. These things are being measured very, very accurately down to the millisecond level. So they need GPS time to be able to coordinate across the country, since GPS time is very stable in that respect. And when you stick it directly in the video file, then you go back there and you can see exactly when things are changing very, very accurately. Now, the size and shape of the asteroid is measured indirectly from the occultation times across the country using all the separate observations. And here's what it looks like when you actually start doing that. This is a different asteroid and a different occultation. This one's 16 Psyche. But if you look at the left side here, you can see each one of these is one of those occultation data points. Each one of these lines is a person parked somewhere out in the path of essentially totality for this asteroid passing in front of the star. Each one of these little kind of dots here is actually, I think, the error curves for that particular measurement. Where it says Foxtrot here and X-ray over here, those are actually the names of features on the surface of the asteroid that the astronomers have given them. 16 Psyche actually is been imaged to by 4 huge Earth-based telescopes starting in 2015. They're going to visit it with a satellite, with a spacecraft that is going to be launched in 2022. So they were looking at it to try to see where they might want to put down what its size was, what its shape was, to make sure that they can line up all the orbital stuff properly. These telescopes, give you an idea, these were our Arecibo, which has since collapsed and doesn't work anymore. That was one of the biggest fixed radio telescopes in the world. The Atacama Large Millimeter Array, and that is 66 separate radio telescopes that are hooked together electronically. The Keck telescope in Hawaii and the very large telescope in the Atacama Desert in Chile. They were using adaptive optics for these things. Adaptive optics are where they use little actuators on the base of the mirror so that and use a laser, and they watch the point from the laser in the mirror, and they use it to change the surface of the mirror to make up for the turbulence that I showed you on the previous graph there, so that you get much better pictures. The occultations were done by pretty much the same amateurs as did 57 Demoscene. It was being done because they're going to visit this thing. So the amateur data was accurate and precise enough that the researchers used it to constrain or limit some of the data from the 4 of the largest research telescopes available. They put all of this stuff together to try to get the best pictures and ideas of the asteroids as they can, so that when they go up there with a spacecraft, they've got the best chance of doing what they want to. Again, good data matters, and these were amateurs that were doing this. This isn't something that was taking $1 billion telescope to do. These are all amateur things. So your projects might just be able to help too, depending on what you're doing. So, anybody have any questions?